All right. Lovely. Okay, so we have 60 participants. That's half of the class. All right, folks. So maybe it would be okay if I just shared my screen with you. I want to try to show you where you can find the exam. I know most of you have done the mock exam, but I'm going to go to tracks and I'm already logged in. I go to my class. Here we are. Oops, excuse me. Here we are in tracks. I'm going to go to assessments. I'm going to put this in student mode. Remember to mute yourself until you want to ask a question and unmute yourself. I prefer not to use my mute all power. Okay, so here we are. Here's the mock exam. All right, so this is where you're going to open up the mock exam. There are no questions there, but you see you have an hour-and-a-half time limit. So I know that if you like accidentally close the browser, you're cool, but you have to log back in because once that hour-and-a-half starts,
I was like, you over yet? And he was like, I don't know about that, but definitely.
Once you start that exam, what that hour-and-a-half, that's all the time that you have. Okay. So that's where you're going to find the exam, but instead of saying mock exam, it's going to say sorry, I'm just wanting to sort of catch up with your Zoom chats here. Instead of saying mock exam number 2, it's going to say exam number 2. All right. Folks, I want you just to know that it's important you can say something about these terms. And I just pulled these terms directly from the PowerPoints. I didn't even go back to the readings. So, and you know, just sort of, again, for those of you who have just come on recently, hello, welcome, I wish you well. I want you to understand that we're gonna make this as straightforward and easy as possible. So there's gonna be a lot of simple definitions in exam number 2. Exam number 3 might be a little bit more rigorous, a little bit more akin to exam number 1. But I want you to understand that that you know we're really taking into account the fact that we're all just in difficult conditions here. Okay, so I'm a little bit nervous about my recording situation. Let me just double check that. I think, yep, here we are. I'm recording. Okay, so let me go back to screen share. Yeah, it's going to be me here. Let's do this screen share. Here we are. Okay, so I think the best way to prepare for exam number 2 is for us to go through these terms. I want you to take a minute. I've asked you to pull up this review sheet for the purposes of this class. So I'm going to give you just maybe 30 seconds to do that. And I'm going to let you unmute yourselves and ask about a term, okay? So just a couple of minutes here for you to look at the list of terms. Maybe what I can do here, we've got them on the screen. I really encourage you to bring up this document. Mm-hmm. All right, does anybody have any questions about these terms that they couldn't define? If I asked you right now to write one sentence about this term, what would you write? Okay, so go ahead and unmute yourself, and this is your time to ask some questions about the terms that you're unfamiliar with.
Can you go over what a second world is, please, for me?
Yes, very good. I'm about 90% certain that you're going to get your short answer question, that big question where you write at the end, that's going to ask you about the historical origins of the third world and the original meanings of the term first world, second world, and third world. So thank you for letting me situate that question about the second world within what I think is going to be the essay question, right? So the first world, the second world, and the third world, those categories were created at the end of World War II. And does anybody want to take a stab at giving me the definition, the original definition of first world, second world, and third world when those terms were created at the end of World War II?
Was first world capitalist, second world communist, and third world was like unassigned?
Exactly. First world means capitalist economy, democratic political system, democratic government. Second world means communist government and a command-based economy where the state dictates production, wages, prices. And the third world were the countries that were not part of the first world or the second world. And you have to remember that at the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, Russia, emerged as the two major victors of World War II. So the Cold War period, which is a really important idea to understand, the Cold War is the period between 1940s and 1989 that really shaped global politics in really influential ways. And indeed, those original definitions of first world, second world, and third world are a reflection of the Cold War and the battle between first world countries and their allies, Western Europe, right? Second world countries, Russia, later China, its allies, Eastern European countries. And then the third world were those countries that were unaligned, up for grabs. And that relates to the project of international development, okay? And the idea that if the United States and Western European countries feared that if third world countries who were not aligned with the United States and were not aligned with the USSR, that if the United States did not develop those countries and spread capitalist markets and integrate the third world into the United States and Western European economies, that they might fall prey to communism. Okay. So another question you need to be able to answer is, what were the historical conditions that created the third world? And certainly the end of World War II, right? Which was this moment in which the United States and the USSR emerge as two competing global superpowers. You know, old school European superpowers, England, Spain, France, those people who wheeled and dealed in colonialism, their day is gone, right? And this is a new era, 1940 to 1990, in which the United States and the Soviet Union are battling for the hearts and minds of people around the world. So that's a really good question. Okay, so back to these terms, other terms people want defined.
Can you define Keynesian economics?
Keynesian economics?
Oh yeah, not that one.
Keynesian economics, very good. Okay, so Keynesian economics is the set of ideas and theories about that were popular in the United States that that were part of the New Deal post World War II. And Keynesian economics was the dominant ideology about how to run the US economy from 1940s until 1980s. Okay, so what we're getting at here, folks, is our chapters of globalization and our chapters of political economy. And Keynesian economics is the opposite of neoliberalism. So this is important, and I'm not gonna, let me just think about for a minute here. I do wanna go to, I'm still sharing my screen so you can see here. I'm gonna go to resources. I'm gonna go to neoliberalism and structural adjustment policies, and I think we are here. I think I put Keynesianism, Keynesian economics on this slide. What's important for you to understand is that, okay, so here we go. This is what I wanted. All right, perfect. I've got this sort of understanding of chapters of globalization. Remember when we started out this course, we were making the argument that what most people call globalization today is actually the period from the 1970s until today. And in actuality, that was just one chapter of globalization, one chapter of global history. Neoliberalism is the name that I give to the period from 1980 until today that's all about free trade, telecommunication, all of that. There was the break of the 1970s, a huge economic crisis in the 1970s that enabled the chapter of neoliberal globalization to be born. And basically, the idea is that from 1940 until 1980 in the United States and around the world, it was not about free trade. It was about countries using tariffs and quotas to protect their economies. It wasn't the idea of economic liberalism, where you specialize in your comparative advantage and trade on the global economy everything else that you need. What was happening in the 1940s and the 1980s was the idea that states, governments, the US government, the Mexican government, the Guatemalan government should be using their power as a government to manipulate the economy to best serve the people. That was Keynesian economics. It's a theory of economic nationalism. It is the opposite of the theory of the invisible hand that defined both liberalism before it and neoliberalism after it. It's about the state manipulating the value of currency or interest rates to always try to maintain full employment. Keynesian economics is epitomized in the New Deal in the United States, which was the creation of Social Security, the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, the Federal Housing Administration, the GI Bill, all of these programs that were meant to stimulate economy and build the middle class. The state was supposed to play a big role. Economic liberalism argues that the state should get out of the market. Okay, so that's my answer on sort of my review on Keynesian economics. It's another way of talking about a period of time in which people believed, people in power, and it was common sense, popular understanding that states should be spending a lot of money on supporting a social safety net for people and also manipulating the economy to try to, meet the unemployment, to reduce unemployment and stimulate the growth of the middle class. Okay, so back to, thank you for that question. That allowed me to review several things. Other terms?
What exactly was the Democratic Spring?
Great question. The Democratic Spring was a period of time in Guatemala from 1944 to 1954, in which two democratically elected presidents ruled the country, governed the country, and those were the only 10 years before them and until 1996, where Guatemala had a democratically elected president. Other questions?
Yeah. Someone had previously asked what was a petrodollar in the chat. I'm just calling it out for them.
Yeah, petrodollars, really interesting. So here we're talking about this period of time of the oil crisis. Petrodollars are very much related to the, let me see, I want to highlight this. We are talking about this here. Okay, and the oil crisis of 1973. Actually, I'm going to underline that because that's super important to answer this question. Okay, so what we're getting at again is sort of this moment of what enables the transition from Keynesian economics in the United States to neoliberal economics in the United States. And of course, we need to talk a lot about structural adjustment policies, because structural adjustment policies through IMF loans, that's the way that neoliberal policies arrive to third world countries. Okay, but let's go back to this question about petrodollars. To understand petrodollars, you've got to understand that major economic crises enable these transitions between what is dominant economic thought. And an argument that I'm working with and that several other people make is that this transition between liberalism, economic protectionism, nationalism, liberalism, economic nationalism and protectionism, this sort of idea that free markets, no, states lead markets. Free markets, no, states lead markets. Those chapters are interrupted by economic crisis. The Great Depression. The Great Depression ended colonialism, among other things. Then we have Keynesian economics, the New Deal in the United States. Oh, we talked a little bit about development, right? What's happening in the third world in this period? Third world countries are borrowing billions of dollars as they buy into this project of development, that they too can modernize along the lines of the United States if only they can build the roads, the ports, the irrigation infrastructure, the hydrologic, the hydroelectric dams, the railroads, the electrical networks, the telecommunication facility. So the third world countries are borrowing in this moment where everybody thinks states should play a big role in developing their markets, but bam, 1973 and 1979, we have oil crises. The second big economic crisis after the Great Depression. And it's in this moment that folks like von Hayek, folks like Friedman at the Chicago School in the United States, who thought Keynesian economics was a bunch of garbage, what they did is they took advantage of this moment of crisis to say, hey, you know, this crisis was created by Keynesian economics, and part of it was. But what happened was with the Volcker shock, which is another term on your list. Okay, wait. Let me take a step back. I want to cover several key points here. 1973, oil crisis. What happens in 1973? Somebody tells me somebody tell me what happens with oil prices as a result of the OPEC embargo. And who is OPEC?
The the countries who produce the oil decide to reduce the influx of oil to the Western countries due to their support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War.
OPEC has a homepage. I know I'm sharing the screen with y'all. But here, let's, Wikipedia is always sort of a great way to navigate or orient yourself to a topic. I think you can't cite Wikipedia in your research papers. You cite what Wikipedia cites, but nonetheless, we use Wikipedia to sort of get an overview. You're exactly right, Mario. It is the OPEC stands for the Organization of Petrol Exporting Countries. 14 countries. Okay, it includes Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Russia. These are the countries that, think about Jared Diamond, were blessed with having a natural abundance in oil. And what they do, this is very anti-economic liberalism. This is not the idea of economic liberalism. Those 14 countries, they get together and they decide how much to produce, how much not to produce, to control the price of oil on a global scale. And and you saw that most of those countries are in the Middle East, where a lot of those oil reserves are located. And in 1973, Saudi Arabia and many of its allies got together and they decided to cut global production of oil in 1973. Yes, to penalize the United States and Western European countries for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Okay, so those details are kind of important, but what you need to understand is that when the cost of oil goes up because of a cut in production, the cost of everything goes up, all right? The world enters an economic recession. In 1979, we have the Iranian Revolution. We're getting there after exam number 2. We're going to get to the history of Iran and the United States and talk about the 1979 Iranian Revolution. But Iran as a major oil producer and the revolution of 1979, again, OPEC flexes its muscles and the political turmoil results in reduced production of oil. Prices go sky high. And another economic recession. So because of reasons that were totally outside of the control of many third world countries, most certainly, what happens is in the 1970s, the global economy goes to crap, like since the 1920s. And that's when neoliberal economic theorists, represented by the Mont Pelerin Society, step in and say, we have a solution to get you out of this mess. Keynesian economics, not the way to go. Neoliberal economics. We have to bring back the principles of capitalism, of liberal economic theory, but it's called neoliberal because this is the second major chapter in global history where liberal economic theory has dominated in contemporary history. So the petrodollars, to go back to the petrodollars, sorry. In 1973, when OPEC for the first time started messing with oil prices to engage in geopolitics, the United States threatened to militarily intervene in the region to restore the flow of oil. And the compromise that the Saudis and the United States came to was that the revenue, the money that Saudi Arabia was making off of this OPEC embargo in 73, the vast amounts of cash they were making, that money would be stored, invested in US banks in US dollars, which meant that since 1973, the United States investment banks have had access to petrodollars, the revenues from the global oil production. And that's the revenue that many US banks in the 1970s are using to loan and make money off interest to many third world countries that get in the crux of the debt crisis in the 1980s. It's kind of really messed up. Okay, so what's the Volcker shock? Somebody tell me, while we're talking about this period of time, let's review the Volcker shock.
That was the dramatic increase in the percentages on loans.
Yes, exactly. So part of Keynesian economics was to keep interest rates low so that people would borrow and create jobs. But that means that the value of your money gets weaker and weaker. And, you know, and the neoliberals, they say the state shouldn't be interfering in the value of money and inflation and interest rates. Let the market set the inflation rate. Let the market set the interest rate. So a neoliberal thinker comes to power in the US in the form of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. And in 1979, he implements neoliberal policy in the United States, really important. He lets the interest rate on money float rather than being controlled by the state. That's what Keynesian economics says. The state intervenes to keep interest rates low so people continue to borrow, they buy houses. It's a way that the state stimulates the economy. He says, that only creates inflation, stagnation in the long run. You've got to get the state out of the market. The Volcker shock was to raise interest rates in 1979 to float with the market, to control inflation. And that's really important because while those third world countries were taking out huge loans in this period, buying into the project of international development, they can modernize and industrialize like the United States. They're borrowing at 3-4% interest. After the Volcker shock in 79, countries like Mexico are paying double-digit interest rates. And if you've ever had a credit card, you know what it means when you have a debt that's being charged 3% interest versus 18% interest. You'll never get out of debt paying 18% interest. It just won't happen. That's what happened with third world countries after the Volcker shock. And that's what created the lost decade, the decade of economic crisis in third world countries. All right, let's return back to this list here. Trickle-down economics is part of neoliberalism. The idea that this is the idea that if you get the state out of the market and you don't have states taxing corporations, you don't have states owning corporations, you have private sector companies owning telecommunications and garbage and water, some of these industries that governments used to run because they saw them as like central to life. You let the market and private sector do that, things are going to be more efficient. And the benefits of sort of rising all boats will trickle down to poor people. So the theory of neoliberal economics is that you cut taxes for the rich and for corporations, and with that money that they save, they'll invest in productivity, and those benefits will trickle down to everybody else. But what we talked about in one of our lectures was that that's not always the case. Right? So what has happened in the United States under neoliberalism is that oftentimes those tax savings that companies have experienced has not been has not translated into higher wages for workers. Productivity has gone up, but real wages of what average American workers are earning in this country has stayed the same or gotten worse since the 1970s, folks. And what this means is that the US economy is making a lot of money, but this is the money that's going to the top wage earners, the CEOs, the shareholders. This is what people who are making the stuff and doing the work are getting paid. But one of the main arguments of neoliberalism, or the critiques of neoliberalism, is that it has created a huge income inequality in the United States, because whereas before the state was heavily taxing wealthy people and corporations and investing that money in schools or reducing the cost of tuition, now those cost burdens are being passed on. And really what happens is that companies buy more stocks, they do stock buybacks, they pay super bonuses to their CEOs and their upper management. So one of the critiques of neoliberalism is this growing inequality. Oops. All right, what other questions do you have?
Will you go over narco state?
Yes, I love talking about narco. A narco state is a state that has completely infiltrated. The narco state is a state like Guatemala and Honduras. We talked and El Salvador, but less so El Salvador today. There's some hope. But what I would say is that a narco state today is Honduras and Guatemala. And what I mean by a narco state, and what people other besides me, I didn't coin that term, I wish I had, is that it's a state that has been completely infiltrated by drug trafficking organizations, so that there is no clear line distinguishing where the nation state of Honduras starts and the drug trafficking criminal organization of, I'm not going to name them while we're online and this is being taped, where criminal cartels begin. In Guatemala, it would be, there's no clear line where the Guatemalan state ends and Mexican cartels begin in terms of their influence and their power. Other questions? That was a good one.
What were the scorched earth campaigns?
Anybody want to answer that question? Thank you. That's a really great one. Scorched earth campaigns. I feel like I'm spelling Cabiles wrong. Kai. Anybody know what the scorched earth campaign is? So the scorched earth campaign is, it's a really specific term, an empirical term. It is a term that comes from the Guatemalan Civil War, when we talked about the Northern Triangle, which is, what three countries comprise the Northern Triangle? I know somebody's got that. Besides Mario, who's been great. Come on, folks, Northern Triangle, three countries. Which ones are they?
Isn't it Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador?
Yes, excellent, indeed. Those are the three countries that make up the Northern Triangle. Yes, most definitely. And we were talking about the Cold War, which we've already reviewed today, talked a little bit about the Cold War, that during the Cold War, which was a fear of communism, right, in the United States, that the United States CIA and military intervened in many countries in Latin America under this fear that communism was spreading to third world countries. Remember, we talked about this. Okay. So, yes, the history of the Northern Triangle reveals that indeed a lot of the security issues that those three countries face are a reflection of their Cold War history and the history of the United States and the CIA intervening in the Northern Triangle countries to shape those countries, to protect American economic interests in those countries. So this Scorched Earth campaign comes from a history that I know very, very well of the U.S. intervention in Guatemala. So there's going to be quite a few questions about the history of the United States in Guatemala, particularly in the Guatemalan Civil War. Does anybody know the dates of the Guatemalan Civil War? It's 1960 to 1996. I'm not going to ask a question like that on the exam, but I do want you to understand that there was a civil war from 1960 to 1996, a 36-year civil war. And the war started in 1960 following the CIA-led coup in Guatemala. And the CIA-led coup in Guatemala in 1954 ousted a democratically elected president in Guatemala who had implemented land reform that took away 200,000 acres of the United Fruits land ownings in Guatemala in 1952. And does anybody know, this is extra credit bonus point, 10 extra bonus points, I'm just kidding, but does anybody know the United Fruit Company? What is United Fruit Company today?
Chiquita Banana.
Chiquita Banana, yes, Chiquita Banana. Chiquita Banana, I double dare you to go to HEB and find a banana that was not produced in Guatemala. You might find some from Ecuador, but Chiquita Banana still has 90% ownership of the banana market, as you heard in the Life and Debt video, right? But to make a long story short, the United Fruit Company was the largest landowner in Guatemala. When Jacobo Arbenz, during the Democratic Spring, implemented land reform. And he took away 200,000 acres, which is not a whole bunch, of the United Fruit Company, and he paid the company for the land that he took, and he redistributed that land to peasants to break the colonial chains of Guatemala. And the US government didn't like that because there were several powerful people in the US government that were also representatives of the UFC company. Can anybody name the brothers that were Secretary of State and head of the Pentagon, head of the CIA in 1950s when USA invaded Guatemala?
Is it the Dulles brother?
Yes, the Dulles brothers. You go through the airport. I think it's in Dulles. I think it was Baltimore or New York. I went through
Washington.
Washington. Yes, I went through that airport. I was like, oh my gosh, right? I mean, these men occupied powerful positions in the United Fruit Company, and they were also in charge of the State Department and the CIA. And I feel like they used their dual hats as leaders of and benefactors, economic owners of the UFC, and number 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever they were in US government, to use the power of the US military to protect their own very business interests, right? And so to make a long story short, I need to move a little bit faster, but the US government backed a CIA-led coup in Guatemala. And after many Guatemalans felt like they had exhausted democratic means for change and revolution in their country, they felt like they had no other option but to take up arms. And in 1960, there were several guerrilla groups that took up arms to fight the Guatemalan state in attempts to defeat them militarily after defeating them democratically, but the coup ousted their guy. So they take up arms, and the guerrillas were going to win. by the late 1970s, the guerrillas, it looked like the guerrillas in Guatemala were going to defeat the state. And that's when Rios Montt, I want you to know this guy's name, Rios Montt in 1980, he said, if you want to defeat the guerrillas, you got to remove the water from the fish. And what he meant by removing the water from the fish was that you had to remove the civilian support base of the guerrillas. And that's when the Guatemalan state, the Guatemalan military, began a campaign of genocide and started killing any Mayan communities that might even be suspect of giving information or food or water or shelter to any guerrilla forces. He implemented the Scorched Earth campaign, which was a campaign of genocide in Guatemala that wiped 426 communities off the map. 200,000 people died in Guatemala during the Civil War from 1960 to 1996. And the US government funded, trained, and provided information intel for the Guatemalan forces. So the Scorched Earth campaign and the UN declared that 93% of civilian deaths occurred at the hands of the Guatemalan military, not the guerrillas, which the Guatemalan state argued for a long time. So that's the Scorched Earth campaign. It's a really sad moment in history. Okay, other questions on the, let's go ahead and move to some of these short answer questions, okay? What is a discourse? I'm not going to ask this question. I might ask you to define a discourse in a multiple choice or ID question. A discourse are all of the ways of talking about and representing a phenomenon. We have studied the discourse of development, the third world. I asked you in class, when I say development or the third world, what comes to mind? Despite the fact that many of you have not spent any significant amount of time in a so-called third world country, you had very strong views about what the third world is all about. That's the power of discourse. You've never even been to a place, but yet you think you know it, right? And you know it in a way that positions first world countries as superior to third world countries. This is how power operates through knowledge production, how we name places, how we name spaces. This question, folks, I think I haven't written the exam because you know this is the first time I've taught this class and I'm trying to teach my own kids at home. I'm writing the exam with Sarah Moya right now. But this is what it's going to be about. What were the original meanings of the term first world, second world, and third world? How did the project of third world development transform the meaning of the third world? Okay. Okay, so if somebody's out there who can help me think through how, okay, we talked about the original meanings of first world, second world, and third world. If third world originally meant non-aligned with either the United States or the USSR in the Cold War, how did non-aligned come to mean poor, underdeveloped, not modern, needs to be industrialized? Could somebody talk about that?
Well, since they weren't aligned, does that mean it was because of that reason that they weren't industrialized? So that was the project, was to industrialize them and get them over to one of the first world countries.
Yes, but really explicitly, Mario, what happened was the United States, the first world, thought that if those third world countries, many of whom were former colonies, right? Because decolonization is part of the historical context that creates the third world, right? That if those third world countries were not integrated into the first world, if their poverty was not resolved, if their lack of development was not resolved, then they were going to fall prey to communism. So the poverty of the third world becomes a problem to solve because first world countries feared that if third world countries remain poor, they would fall into communism. They would become part of the second world in this grand battle for first world versus second world, right? So the project of third world development, the idea that first world countries are intervening in third world countries to alleviate their poverty through capitalist development, that whole project is to resolve the problem of their poverty so that they will not fall prey to communism. That is the concern.
Was it
And
was
so, go ahead.
was it a project to alleviate poverty, or was it a project to secure the alliance of the governments?
It was both. It was both. But if you are, if you're critical of this history and you sort of look at global poverty today, what you see is that through the project of third world development, what happened was first world countries like the United States said, Guatemala is poor because they don't have capitalist development. They need more markets. They need more industrialization. They need more modernization, which meant that Guatemala opened up to foreign direct investment, opened up to U.S. economies. So it made U.S. economies, U.S. companies and the U.S. economy really rich as well. So it was a way for the so-called first world to determine the future and development of third world countries. Let's talk a little bit about structural adjustment policies. What are structural adjustment policies? Can anybody define those for me? Emily, I see you out there. Leslie, what's up? Catherine.
Their policies implemented in third world countries in order to support first world countries. Well, basically, with the excuse that it's going to promote trade and it's going to increase the economy within the third world countries.
Yes, that's right. When did structural adjustment policies come to third world countries?
After they receive loans from the IMF. So the IMF.
Yeah, Mario, did you watch the film Life and Debt?
Yes.
Yeah. How many of you have had a chance to watch Life and Debt? I'm just curious. I'm trying to also get a sense for like who's able to keep up with the work. Elias Mendoza says that he watched it. Who else watched it? Did you like it? Yeah, what struck you as interesting from that film? John, Lindsay, what did you think?
Honestly, it kind of made me sad.
Oh, yeah, indeed, right? Tell me
It's
more
just-
about that.
It's just really sad to think, like, because I know a lot of people who have gone, like, to Jamaica and stuff, like, as, like, a trip. And it's just sad thinking about the other side of it and, like, how badly the people are struggling over there and stuff. But, like, it's advertised as just, like, a fun vacation place, but in reality, like, so many of the people there are struggling. It's, like, a small few that are, like, doing really well with the, like, resort business and stuff.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and for me, that's all about the politics of mobility. You know, who can move where and under what conditions and who has the power to determine all of that. and how the politics of mobility today is a reflection of past histories of mobilities and connections and wealth accumulation, right?
And also, it was really shocking to me how little the people made per week. They made like $30 US per week or something like that. And I don't know how far their money goes for them, like how expensive things are there, but like it's just really sad to think they live on so little.
I went to Jamaica a long time ago, and one of the things I remember, I was really young. One of the things I remember is at a restaurant that the people owned, they were living in like an old abandoned jail cell, like an outpost on the side of the road. There was like 3 cells, and like 30 people were living there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's really horrible when you sort of see the depths of third world poverty for the first time. And I know there are several people in our course who are living, you know, who have grown up in those places, most definitely. But one of the things that was really important for me growing up was when I was 18, I did a year of like a gap year between high school and college, where I went to Mexico and Costa Rica. And I was just horrified by the poverty. Alexis, I'm hoping that the audio will be just fine on the review, on the video that I post. So I know that a couple of you are having some problems. You know, this is also sort of like one of the reasons I kind of didn't want to do a live Zoom lecture, was that this happens when lots of people get into a space at one time, and I'm also not the best at the audio and all of this. I'm just kind of, you know, doing this from my house.
Professor,
Yes.
would you say like, so I remember like when you were talking about like where you're from, like would you say like your area was very like rough, or did you not really live around that epidemic part where there was like a lot of drugs going on, or was it like just all over the place?
In Guatemala?
Yes. Or
Well, or growing up in the United States.
that one.
In the United States.
Yeah, because I remember you said you were like from a really booming area of like drugs.
Well, okay, so I grew up in a working class household with a single mom. And I grew up in a town that was 50% Latino, 50% white. And I lived in the poor area of town. So I had a lot of exposure to Latino communities, and I really fell in love with Spanish culture and Latino culture. But I did not grow up in the type of poverty that I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, that, and I studied drug trafficking as part of my research. I studied the environmental impacts of drug trafficking. And if that sort of thing interests you and you're looking for an honors thesis in another year or two, come and see me, because there's plenty of work to be done. And we get to do lots of cool things and advise the UN and you know, circulate reports. We've got sort of another 20 minutes left here. I'm sorry that some of you are having troubles with the audio. Okay. Let me just sort of look at some of these questions and see, and you chime in, unmuting yourself. Are there any other vocabulary terms that you're not familiar with? What is the Washington Consensus? It was mentioned briefly in the lecture, briefly in the reading. The Washington Consensus is when Margaret Thatcher in 1979 and Ronald Reagan in 1980 come to the agreement that neoliberal economic reforms are what they're going to implement in their countries. It's like the idea that neoliberal policies go mainstream. They become the new orthodox, the new common sense. Okay.
I have a question about the format
Yes.
of the short answer question. So for like the last one, I was able to write almost like a page and like a quarter of the next one over all the Jared Diamond stuff. But for this one, are you expecting like the same length, like a page, or is it going to be more of like a couple paragraphs?
I think it's going to be a couple paragraphs, which I consider to be a page. So the similar length. And the question that you're going to have, I think, is going to be, I think what's fair given our online transition is what I'm highlighting here. What were the original meanings of the term first world, second world, and third world? I would also ask the question, what were the historical factors that created the third world? Okay, so to get that answer, you want to go to, and the reason that I'm sort of leaning to that question and being really open with all of you is that we were in class together and I had a chance to talk about these ideas, and I know that they're really sort of philosophical and all of that, but this is the lecture. So this is really important, this slide. What was the historical origin of the term the third world? The depression of the 1930s made Europe broke, which led to decolonization. People were already fighting for independence in the colonies, right? But the World War I and the World War II left the European powers so broke they didn't have the money to control their colonies any longer. The United States emerges as a global superpower, so does the USSR. Another factor, a historical factor that led to the creation of the third world was the creation of the global institutions of governance. It was the World Bank that was created with the goal of modernizing and industrializing the third world so it wouldn't become communist, right? This is all within the context of the Cold War. So this slide is really important.
And would you like us to define like how the first world you said was like a capitalist economy and the second world was a command economy? Would you like us to define what those are, or is it just like we're basing it off, you already know what they are?
No, I'm going to ask you to define them, the original meanings of the term. Yes. And what were the historical conditions, that slide that I just showed you, what were the historical conditions that gave rise to the third world? And then I'm going to talk, I don't know, I might just stop it there, but I might also ask sort of as a follow-up, how did the project of third world development transform the meaning of the third world? What we're getting at here is that, Escobar in that, which one was it? This one here, yeah. Sorry, folks. Escobar argues, and we talked about this in the lecture a bit, that the third world was created not, let me see here, okay, that Escobar, this dude here, he's just an example of many people have made this argument, that third world poverty alleviation was not really meant to alleviate poverty. That the goal of development, the goal of this project of the World Bank and the IMF intervening in third world countries is to perpetuate first world control over third world economies. To give first world countries an excuse to meddle, intervene, lend money, tell them what they should do, how they should develop, how they should modernize, how they should industrialize. That the project of development from 1940 until today is not really about goodwill and let's hold hands and solve the problem of poverty. It's about creating capitalist markets in the third world, which allow first world countries to continue to interact with and make money off of third world economies. So what Escobar is going on about is that we have, despite the trillions of dollars that have been spent to develop the third world, we still live in a country where we still live in a world where half of the globe lives on less than $5 a day. So what a colossal failure of a project, right? And what Escobar is going on about is that there has been a huge transfer of wealth. And I think what it says here, $16 trillion has been sucked out of the third world and transferred to the first world from 1980 until 2012, based on this study. Structural adjustment policies, the IMF, and those loans, right? That is part of that's a big part of the explanation of the transfer of wealth. Okay, so let's look some more at these questions. I'm not going to ask this question, what was the Cold War? Do you think it was a founding event like the transatlantic slave trade? I kind of think the Cold War, just because of the project of developing third world countries and spreading capitalism, that it's a founding moment. But what other questions do you have?
Will you go over some key parts of the drug wars?
Yes, let's go and take a quick look at what we saw in lecture based on the drug wars. So I'm going to go back to resources. We were talking about that in relationship to the Northern Triangle, which was under the week 8. So what I want you to understand is that one of the key causes of insecurity in the so-called Northern Triangle is the demand for drugs in the United States. Okay, so this is our lecture that we did when we were working through the role of the United States and the CIA in the Guatemalan coup. And you know what we were going on here was that you have to understand, after all of that nightmare that Guatemala lived through, the scorched earth campaigns of the 1980s, right? Merging from 36 years of civil war that included like the murder of Mayan civilians. After all of that, cocaine comes to town, right? The US government was pursuing shutting down supply routes from Colombia through Caribbean to Florida to the rest of the United States. This is a PBS image, that's funny. But after the death of Pablo Escobar and the shutting down of those routes, cocaine traffickers didn't stop sending drugs to the United States. They just found different ways to do it. #geography. And they started selling their kilos and offloading their kilos to the Mexican cartels who had been operating at a smaller scale, dealing in the production and sale of heroin and marijuana. But with cocaine comes billions and billions and billions of dollars. So the whole point here is that yes, the drug wars contribute to the instability and insecurity in the Northern Triangle today. And you've got to understand, pobre Guatemala, poor Guatemala, right? 500 years of being a colonial resource suction for the enrichment of Spain. And then the country gets its independence and the new leaders continue with the old system to make themselves filthy rich, but now it's US companies rather than Spanish colonial companies that are making money off of Guatemala's resources. There's 10 years in which there's a democratic opening, land reform happens, the US intervenes to support opposing forces, 36 years, 40 years of military dictatorships follow. Finally, the war ends, and then cocaine comes to town. It's just like Central America. And what I mean by that is that the institutions of governance, the presidency, the courts, the police force, the institutions of governance in Guatemala were so weak in the 1990s, following all of this civil war, following all of this history. And then $10 billion a year of cocaine is going to be sloshed through these tiny states. It just creates a horrible situation in which corruption and violence is going to breed in that country. So you have to understand what is so messed up about the Northern Triangle today in Guatemala, which we're talking about. Colonialism, the Guatemalan Civil War, of which the United States played a large role, and the drug wars, of which the United States also played a large role. So that's what I want you to understand there. Other questions, folks? I do want you to be able to talk about the social costs of structural adjustment policies. What is an example of a structural adjustment policy? Can somebody talk to me about examples of structural adjustment policies? Oh, and were structural adjustment policies implemented in the first world or the third world?
Third world.
Third world. So give me some examples of structural adjustment policies, either that you saw through the Life and Debt video or through the lecture.
The cutting of the basic fundamental policies. So like for education, cutting that in order to repay debts after the Volcker shock, which hiked up the prices to prevent countries from bankrupting and forfeiting on their loans.
Yeah, remember that in 1982, after the Volcker shock, Mexico was like, we can't pay this. We're defaulting on our loans. We're going bankrupt. We're declaring bankruptcy. And the IMF was like, you're a country. You can't declare bankruptcy. And Mexican leaders, you know, people often ask, why did Jamaica or Mexico or the other 100 countries that were subject to structural adjustment, why did they accept the terms? Well, if you ain't got bread on the shelves and you ain't got medicine in the pharmacies, people are going to rise up and demonstrate and get violent. So keeping the money running is also about like preventing widespread violence and protest in the country. So these countries had literally the option of taking the IMF loans, which included structural adjustment, or complete social collapse. Collapse of the economy, collapse of society, right? So the argument is that the IMF used the debt crisis, the problem of this debt, which was a product of the Volcker shock and the 73, 79 oil crises, which had nothing to do with what was happening in Mexico, but nonetheless, in this global economy, you bear the brunt. That all of that, you know, impacted them, and they found themselves in this situation with this debt. So they had to implement structural adjustment. As Mario is saying, cut public spending. You suddenly have half the amount of money that you used to have to feed the poor, provide medication for the poor, to educate the poor. And in third world countries, that's a big chunk of the population. What is another example of structural adjustment? Devaluation of what?
Currency.
Mario, you get all the extra credit points today. I don't know if other people have watched The Life and Debt, or maybe they're all busy cooking dinner like your lovely partner in the background. But yes, most certainly devaluing currency rather than the state controlling the price of currency. The market determines the price, which makes exports cheaper, right? Which is all about free trade, and which is what all neoliberalism is all about. Structural adjustment also included privatization of state-owned enterprises. It also included allowing foreign direct investment and national economies. A lot of third world governments feel like they don't want first world countries owning all of the land and all of the resources anymore, right? They feel like those profits should stay in those countries to address the poverty, education, healthcare needs of those people. And what happens under neoliberalism is that those structural adjustment policies really force countries like Jamaica and Mexico to tear down those barriers, rewrite their laws to enable foreign companies to own a larger share of the land and resources. We've got just a couple of minutes left here. I think that you're all going to do just great. As I said before, exam number 2 is going to be an exam light in the sense that I'm going to be asking you to define a lot of these terms and to answer questions that you have been given, okay? I'm not reaching far and wide. This is not the divine shock during the COVID. Pardon the neoliberal joke, but you know, I'm not going to try to stick you with a really hard question. What I want you to do is before Wednesday's exam is to be able to, you know, talk about all of these ideas. One of the things that we didn't talk about was what happened in El Salvador. Bishop Oscar Romero is the bishop that was murdered in El Salvador for asking the United States to stop funding the Salvadorian military. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act implemented expedited removal. This was part of this policy in which a lot of Salvadoran refugees were incarcerated, became MS-13 members, and then were sent back to El Salvador. The idea here, folks, is that you know, the problems of the Northern Triangle with the United States are deeply interrelated. Has anybody taken the you know, the opportunity to look at the mock exam or to see if things are working for them technically?
Yes, I took it.
Was it okay? Were there anything surprising that I should think about at this point before the exam on Wednesday?
No, it looked good.
Okay. What I do understand is that I was concerned that if you closed your browser that you would fail all of the other questions. That's not the case. If for some reason you get logged out of the exam, you can log back in, but once that timer starts, it starts. So you can't, while you can close the browser and log out, as I understand, you can log back in, but you only have that hour and a half, right? So that prevents people from cheating and closing down and looking up the answer. Once you start that exam, you have an hour and a half. Is that clear? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. The other thing that you might want to keep in mind, everybody, is that Sarah Moya is hosting office hours tomorrow. Is it clear to you how to get into office hours with Sarah Moya? Yes, I'm getting a thumbs up. Okay. I'm also going to be online tomorrow, so let me know any questions you have. Are there any other last minute questions for all of you?
I have a question. Like when we do the test, do we need to join the Zoom?
No, you are most certainly not using Zoom for the test. The way that you're going to do the test, who was that that asked that question? Sorry.
Me.
What's your name?
Boren.
Okay, here you are. Okay, so what you're going to do, I'm going to go into student view. Can you see my screen?
No, it's just the terms.
Okay, you can't see, can anybody else see my screen with the assessments page?
No.
You just see like the page with the like terms on it and stuff. Like your Word document still, like the review sheet.
Okay, what you're going to do is that you're going to go to tracks. Hold on. Maybe I don't understand. Sharing is pause. Bring your shared window to the front. Okay, hold on. I'm going to stop this share. This is really important, so I need to make sure that we get this right. Here we are. I didn't understand that it worked that way. I learned something new. Okay, here we are. Can you all see my track site now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so this is the student view. This is what our course looks like to you. You're going to go to assessments, and you're going to see not mock exam number 2, but exam number 2. And this is where you're going to find the exam. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So the exam has nothing to do with Zoom at all. I encourage you to take the mock exam if you haven't, as I explained in the email that I sent around 12:30 today, because tomorrow we have the opportunity to resolve these technical issues, okay? So I need you all to do your part to try out the mock exam and make sure that you understand how the exam can be taken, okay? And again, I think you're all lovely, wonderful people. I'm so sad that our time together has been cut short, but I'm here to help you. And the most important thing is that you reach out to myself and to Sarah Moya, the teaching assistant for this course, and you communicate any problems that you have, because we will work with you, okay? You're not gonna fail this course or get a poor grade because you couldn't figure out how to take the exam. But I do ask you to do your part ahead of time to see if you can take the mock exam today or tomorrow, so that you get the feel of how the exam is going to be administered. Does that make sense?
Okay.
All right. Communicate with me. Like I said, I would love to give you all A's. I want you all to succeed and do the best that you possibly can. Just please put in the effort, and please communicate with me and be patient. And we're going to get through this together, okay? Can we get a virtual high five?
Hell yeah, I got you. I got you, Professor.
Unmute. Okay, high five. Here we go. Can somebody give me a high five? You're all beautiful people. I hope that you're doing okay. If anybody needs some money and is in San Marcos, you can come and work at my house. Hit me up.
Hit me up.
She
said hit me up.
Seriously, if you have financial issues, if you're in an emergency, you can also reach out to Sarah and I, because we might be able to put you into some touch with some resources in the case that you are in danger of dropping out of school. My heart goes out to all of you, and I'm wishing you all of the best, okay?
We can
Thank
just
you, Dr.
email you
Devine.
and ask you that.
What's that?
We can email you to like actually maybe get work. Just
Yes.
email you personally. Okay.
Yes,
Awesome.
yes. Most definitely, okay? And of course, I just want you to know that I'm here to support you as an advisor and as a professor, not just as a person who's administering this course, okay?
Awesome.
All right, folks, we're gonna get through it. Hit me up tomorrow with any questions or concerns. Otherwise, we'll see you on Wednesday for the exam.
Thanks so much.
you.
All right, take care, everybody.
Yeah.
All right, hang in there.